Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a bit different, something darker. We're leaving behind the disciplined misery of Roman legions and venturing into the absolute abyss of human cruelty. Tonight, we're exploring history's most ruthless dictators, the masters of systematic brutality, who turned entire civilizations into their personal torture chambers. So before we descend into this particular circle of hell, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you have the stomach for what we're about to uncover. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you're brave enough to make it through the whole thing. It's always fascinating to see who's willing to stare into the darkness with me. Now, maybe grab a strong drink, dim those lights, and prepare yourself for a journey through the most disturbing chapters of human history. We're not talking about your garden variety bad leaders here. We're talking about the artists of agony, the sculptors of suffering, the men who discovered that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it reveals the monsters that were lurking beneath the surface all along. So, you think you understand evil? You think your worst enemy is truly cruel, adorable, truly like thinking a paper cut compares to medieval torture. Tonight, we meet the real champions of human misery, the failed art students, paranoid seminary dropouts, and genocidal visionaries who wrote their names in history with the blood of millions. These weren't cartoon villains in dark castles. These were flesh and blood humans who transformed entire societies into killing machines, and the most terrifying part, they started out just as human as you and me. Fair warning, this isn't going to be comfortable. We're about to tour the Hall of Fame of human monsters, where the entry fee was measured in millions of lives, and the only graduation ceremony was death. So settle in, steel yourself, and let's explore together why civilization is just a thin veneer over something much, much darker. So you think you know cruelty. You think your boss is a tyrant because he makes you work late on Fridays. Let me introduce you to the real champions of human misery, the masters of institutional brutality, the men who turned entire civilizations into their personal torture chambers. These weren't just bad leaders. These were artists of agony, sculptors of suffering, poets of pain, who wrote their verses in blood and carved their signatures into the bones of history. Welcome to the Hall of Fame of human monsters, where the entry fee was measured in millions of lives, and the only graduation ceremony was death. These weren't cartoon villains, twirling mustaches in dark castles. They were flesh and blood humans who discovered that absolute power doesn't corrupt absolutely. It reveals what was already there, lurking beneath the surface like a tumor waiting for the right conditions to metastasize. Let's start with the granddaddy of them all, the man who made genocide an industrial process. Adolf Hitler didn't invent hatred, but he perfected it like Henry Ford perfected the assembly line. Except instead of cars rolling off the production line, it was corpses. This failed art student from Austria took rejection letters from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and transformed them into the blueprint for the systematic extermination of entire peoples. Talk about turning lemons into very, very poisonous lemonade. Picture this: a man so mediocre that he couldn't even succeed as a postcard painter, standing in front of crowds of thousands, foaming at the mouth about racial purity. The irony was thicker than the mustache he borrowed from Charlie Chaplin. But here's the thing about Hitler that makes him particularly terrifying. He wasn't some frothing madman ranting in a padded cell. He was methodical, organized. He had spreadsheets for his genocide, bureaucrats for his brutality, and middle managers for his murder. The Holocaust wasn't the work of a lone lunatic. It was the product of an entire society that decided to outsource its conscience to a failed painter with daddy issues and a Napoleon complex. Millions of ordinary Germans, Austrians, Poles, and others became complicit in the most organized slaughter in human history. They stamped papers that sent families to their deaths, drove trains loaded with human cargo to extermination camps, and went home to kiss their children goodnight as if they'd spent the day selling insurance instead of facilitating mass murder. Hitler's genius, if we can call it that without vomiting, was understanding that most people don't want to think too hard about moral complexity. Give them an enemy to blame for their problems, a simple solution to complicated issues, and the permission to unleash their worst impulses, and they'll march in lockstep toward any atrocity you can imagine. He took the ancient art of scapegoating and industrialized it, complete with efficiency experts and quality control supervisors. But Hitler was just the opening act in our parade of human monsters. Let's travel east to meet Uncle Joe Stalin, a man who made the Grim Reaper look like a part-time employee. Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili, try saying that 5 times fast while your tongue is still attached, started life as a Georgian seminary student who apparently missed the class on "Thou shalt not kill." He studied to be a priest, but decided that playing God was more fun than serving him. Stalin's specialty was making people disappear, not with magic tricks, but with midnight knocks on doors and one-way tickets to Siberia. He turned paranoia into a governing philosophy and suspicion into state policy. In Stalin's Soviet Union, being accused of disloyalty was tantamount to being guilty of it, and being guilty of it was tantamount to being dead, exiled, or worked to death in conditions that made medieval dungeons look like luxury spas. The man was so paranoid that he purged his own purgers. He eliminated the people who eliminated people for him, creating a perpetual cycle of terror where today's executioner became tomorrow's victim. It was like a twisted version of musical chairs, except when the music stopped, someone got shot in the back of the head in a basement at the Lubyanka prison. Stalin's crowning achievement in human misery was the Holodomor, the artificial famine he created in Ukraine that killed millions. He literally starved people to death while exporting grain to other countries. Imagine being so committed to your political ideology that you'd rather watch children die of hunger than admit your economic policies were fundamentally flawed. That takes a special kind of evil, the kind that wears a grandfatherly mustache and smiles while signing death warrants. But wait, there's more! Because history is nothing if not generous with its supply of human monsters. Let's take a trip to Cambodia and meet Pol Pot, a man whose name sounds like a cooking utensil, but whose legacy was serving up genocide with a side of cultural destruction. Saloth, as he was born, took the concept of starting over and applied it with the subtlety of a nuclear weapon. Pol Pot's vision was simple: turn Cambodia back into an agrarian paradise by eliminating anyone who had ever seen a book, worn glasses, or spoken a foreign language. His Khmer Rouge regime didn't just kill people, they tried to kill the very concept of civilization itself. They emptied cities at gunpoint, marched urban dwellers into the countryside to die of starvation and exhaustion, and systematically murdered anyone who looked too educated, which in their mind included anyone who could read. Wearing glasses was a death sentence because it suggested you were literate. Speaking a foreign language meant you were corrupted by outside influence. Having soft hands meant you hadn't done manual labor and were therefore a parasite on society. The Khmer Rouge created a checklist for execution that was so comprehensive it would have made the Spanish Inquisition jealous. At least the inquisitors bothered with trials, even if they were kangaroo courts presided over by men who thought the earth was flat. In just 4 years, Pol Pot and his merry band of psychopaths managed to kill roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population. That's not a typo. 1 in 4 Cambodians died during the Khmer Rouge regime. They didn't have industrial gas chambers like the Nazis, so they improvised with farming tools, clubs, and good old-fashioned starvation. They turned the entire country into a killing field, literally, and the term, killing fields, entered our vocabulary because of their industrial-scale butchery. Now let's swing by China to visit Chairman Mao, a man who thought the best way to modernize a nation was to accidentally starve 40 million people. Mao Zedong had big dreams and even bigger delusions. He wanted to turn China into an industrial powerhouse overnight, but he had about as much understanding of economics as a goldfish has of quantum physics. Mao's great leap forward was more like a great leap backward off a cliff while blindfolded and carrying anvils. His brilliant plan involved turning farmers into steelworkers and steelworkers into farmers, because apparently expertise is overrated when you have revolutionary fervor and a little red book full of fortune cookie wisdom. The result was predictably catastrophic. Crops rotted in fields while farmers tried to smelt steel in backyard furnaces, producing worthless metal while the nation starved. But Mao wasn't content with just economic incompetence. He also gave us the Cultural Revolution, a decade-long temper tantrum that destroyed thousands of years of Chinese culture and turned children against their parents, students against their teachers, and neighbors against neighbors. Red Guards, mostly teenagers drunk on ideology and armed with revolutionary zeal, roamed the country destroying anything that smacked of tradition, education, or common sense. The Cultural Revolution was like Lord of the Flies, but with 1 billion participants and nuclear weapons. Mao unleashed the fury of youth against the wisdom of age, and the result was a society that ate itself alive. Teachers were beaten by their students. Intellectuals were sent to pig farms to learn from the masses, and anyone who had ever owned a book or expressed an independent thought was branded an enemy of the people. Mao's body count is staggering, somewhere between 40 and 80 million people, depending on who's counting, and whether you include deaths from famine, persecution, and general policy incompetence. That's roughly the entire population of Germany, wiped out by one man's megalomaniacal delusions and the unwillingness of an entire society to tell him he was wrong. Speaking of unwillingness to tell dictators they're wrong, let's visit Uganda and meet Idi Amin, a man who combined the bloodthirstiness of a medieval warlord with the delusions of grandeur of a comic book villain. Amin styled himself, His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada VC DSOMC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular. That's not a joke. That was his actual official title, because apparently when you're compensating for deep-seated insecurities, you need a really, really long business card. Amin ruled Uganda like it was his personal video game, except instead of respawning, people just died and stayed dead. His idea of foreign policy was to challenge other world leaders to boxing matches, and his notion of economic planning involved expelling Uganda's entire Indian population and giving their businesses to his cronies, who ran them into the ground faster than you could say hyperinflation. Amin's cruelty wasn't systematic like Hitler's or ideological like Stalin's. It was personal, capricious, and utterly unpredictable. He once ordered the massacre of an entire tribe because he had a nightmare about them. He allegedly kept the severed heads of his enemies in his refrigerator, next to the milk and leftover takeout. He claimed to be the uncrowned King of Scotland and offered to help solve Britain's economic problems by becoming their monarch. The man was clearly insane, but he was insane with an army and absolute power, which is like giving a loaded gun to a toddler with anger management issues. In 8 years, he managed to destroy one of Africa's most prosperous nations and kill an estimated 500,000 people, all while convincing himself he was Uganda's savior and the world's greatest leader. Let's not forget Saddam Hussein, who turned Iraq into his personal torture chamber and the Middle East into his sandbox for military adventures that invariably ended in disaster. Saddam had all the charm of a rabid wolverine and the diplomatic skills of a brick through a window. He ruled Iraq with an iron fist wrapped in a steel glove, inside a titanium mitten, attached to an arm made of pure paranoia. Saddam's Iraq was a place where dissent was met with chemical weapons, where political opposition was literally fed into industrial shredders, and where the president's sons collected luxury cars and tortured people for entertainment. Uday and Qasem Hussein made their father look reasonable by comparison, which is like making Hannibal Lecter look like a picky eater. Saddam's greatest hits include using chemical weapons against his own Kurdish population, starting a decade-long war with Iran that killed over 1 million people on both sides, invading Kuwait because he needed some quick cash and thought the international community wouldn't mind, and building palaces while his people lived in poverty and fear. He was like a Middle Eastern Caligula, except Caligula at least had the decency to limit his reign of terror to the Roman Empire, instead of dragging neighboring countries into his psychotic power fantasies. The man literally had portraits of himself hung in every public building, on every street corner, and probably in every bathroom stall in Iraq. He commissioned artists to paint him in various heroic poses: Saddam the warrior, Saddam the statesman, Saddam the wise leader, Saddam the guy who definitely doesn't have small hands or deep-seated daddy issues. It was like living inside a very violent, very expensive ego trip funded by oil money and sustained by fear. Now let's venture into the heart of darkness that was Equatorial Guinea under Francisco Marques Nguema, a man who managed to turn a small African nation into his personal horror movie. Machias didn't just rule Equatorial Guinea, he tortured it like a sadistic child pulling the wings off flies. Under his reign, it became statistically safer to be a resident of an active war zone than a citizen of his country. Machias had the distinction of being so comprehensively evil that he managed to kill or exile roughly half of his country's population in just 11 years. That's not genocide efficiency, that's genocide artistry. He banned the word intellectual because he thought it was a foreign plot, outlawed the use of the word work because it reminded him of colonial oppression, and eventually banned all schools because education was apparently a Western conspiracy to undermine his authority. The man was so paranoid that he eventually banned fishing because he was convinced that fishermen were plotting against him from their boats. In a country surrounded by ocean, he made it illegal to derive sustenance from the sea. It's like banning farming in Iowa or snow skiing in Switzerland, a level of paranoid stupidity that transcends ordinary tyranny and enters the realm of performance art. Machias's specialty was creative execution methods. He had people killed by being forced to drink palm wine until they died of alcohol poisoning, buried alive in mass graves, or beaten to death with clubs, while the national anthem played in the background. He turned murder into a grotesque form of entertainment, complete with musical accompaniment and audience participation. Let's not overlook Augusto Pinochet, who turned Chile into a laboratory for economic experimentation and human rights violations. Pinochet took power in a CIA-backed coup and immediately set about proving that military efficiency and human decency are mutually exclusive concepts. His Chile was a place where economists flew in from the Chicago School of Economics to implement free market theories, while dissidents were thrown out of helicopters into the Pacific Ocean. Pinochet's Chile was where neoliberalism was born, baptized in the blood of trade unionists and student protesters. His economic advisors, dubbed the Chicago Boys, implemented pure free market capitalism with the enthusiasm of children playing with dynamite and about as much concern for collateral damage. They privatized everything that wasn't nailed down and then privatized the nails. Meanwhile, Pinochet's secret police, the DIMA, perfected the art of making people disappear. They didn't just kill political opponents, they erased them from existence. Families spent decades searching for loved ones who had vanished into the machinery of state terror, never knowing if they were dead, imprisoned, or exiled to some remote corner of the earth. The irony of Pinochet's regime was that it combined the most advanced economic theories with the most primitive forms of human cruelty. While economists calculated supply curves and demand elasticity, torturers applied electricity to human genitals in basement rooms across Santiago. It was as if the invisible hand of the market was wearing brass knuckles and carrying a cattle prod. But perhaps no dictator understood the theatre of cruelty better than Nicolae Ceausescu, who turned Romania into a bizarre combination of Stalinist repression and personal megalomaniac. Ceausescu didn't just want to rule Romania, he wanted to rebuild it in his own image, literally. He demolished thousands of historic buildings to make room for monuments to himself and his wife Elena, who was about as qualified to be a scientist as a goldfish is qualified to perform brain surgery. Ceausescu's Romania was a place where birth control was banned to increase the population, but children born into this mandate were abandoned to overcrowded, understaffed orphanages that resembled medieval dungeons more than childcare facilities. He forced women to have children they couldn't afford to feed, then took those children away to raise them as wards of the state in conditions that would have made Charles Dickens weep. The man was so convinced of his own genius that he appointed his wife as the head of the National Science Institute. Despite the fact that she had barely finished elementary school, Elena Ceausescu became one of the world's most published scientists without ever conducting a single experiment or writing a single paper. She received honorary doctorates from universities around the world, all of which were too terrified to point out that the woman couldn't spell chemistry, let alone practice it. Ceausescu's grand plan for Romania involved demolishing entire villages to make way for agro-industrial complexes that existed mainly in his imagination. He destroyed centuries-old communities to build concrete monuments to his own vanity, turning one of Europe's most culturally rich nations into a grey wasteland of brutalist architecture and human misery. The couple lived in obscene luxury, while their people stood in bread lines and froze in unheated apartments. They owned dozens of palaces while ordinary Romanians were limited to one light bulb per room and hot water once a week. It was Marie Antoinette and Louise XVI all over again, except with more secret police and fewer decent wigs. Let's take a detour to the ancient world and visit Caligula, a Roman emperor who proved that absolute power and mental instability make for entertaining reading but terrible governance. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula or Little Boots, managed to pack more insanity into 4 years than most dictators manage in decades. Caligula started his reign as Rome's darling, the beloved nephew of the popular general Germanicus. The Roman people expected a golden age of prosperity and military glory. Instead, they got a homicidal maniac with delusions of godhood and a disturbing relationship with his sisters. Within months of taking power, Caligula was talking to statues, appointing his horse as consul, and claiming to be the reincarnation of various gods, depending on his mood and the phase of the moon. The man built a temporary floating bridge across the Bay of Naples, nearly 3 miles long, just so he could ride his horse across it while wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, supposedly to prove a soothsayer wrong. It was the ancient equivalent of spending billions of dollars on a personal space program just to flip off your high school guidance counselor who said you'd never amount to anything. Caligula's cruelty wasn't strategic or ideological, it was purely recreational. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot for miles in their togas, made parents watch their children's executions, and once declared war on Neptune, commanding his soldiers to march to the beach and stab the ocean. He then ordered them to collect seashells as spoils of war, because apparently defeating the god of the sea required some souvenirs. The emperor's spending was as extravagant as his cruelty was capricious. In less than a year, he managed to bankrupt the Roman treasury, which had been overflowing when he inherited it. He threw gladiator games that lasted for days, built pleasure barges that were more luxurious than most palaces, and commissioned statues of himself that cost more than entire provinces' annual tax revenue. Caligula's reign was mercifully brief. He was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard after 4 years of increasingly bizarre behavior. But it demonstrated how quickly a civilization could slide from the heights of power to the depths of madness when led by someone who confused authority with divinity. Speaking of confusing authority with divinity, let's visit ancient Assyria and meet Ashurbanipal, a king who turned warfare into an art form and cruelty into a religious ritual. The Assyrian Empire was history's first superpower, and Ashurbanipal was determined to make sure everyone knew it. His palace walls were decorated with relief sculptures depicting his military victories in excruciating detail, enemies being flayed alive, cities being burned to the ground, captives being impaled on stakes like medieval kebabs. Ashurbanipal didn't just conquer his enemies, he erased them from existence. When he captured the Elamite capital of Susa, he didn't content himself with destroying the city. He salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again, scattered the bones of dead kings to prevent their spirits from finding rest, and carried off the statues of Elamite gods to humiliate their worshippers for generations. The Assyrian war machine was built on a foundation of systematic terror. They perfected the art of psychological warfare, spreading stories of their cruelty to encourage cities to surrender without a fight. It was more efficient to have enemies surrender out of fear than to waste time and resources on actual sieges, although Ashurbanipal seemed to genuinely enjoy the siege part anyway. Assyrian soldiers skinned captives alive and wore their faces as masks, impaled entire populations on wooden stakes arranged artistically around conquered cities, and developed techniques for prolonging suffering that wouldn't be matched until the Spanish Inquisition got creative with their torture devices. They turned cruelty into both a science and an art form, complete with instructional manuals and performance metrics. But Ashurbanipal wasn't just a conqueror. He was also history's first great librarian, which creates one of history's most disturbing contradictions. The same man who ordered the systematic torture of entire populations also assembled the world's first organized library, collecting over 30,000 cuneiform tablets containing the literature, science, and history of Mesopotamia. It's as if Heinrich Himmler had spent his spare time translating poetry and cataloguing rare manuscripts. A Schopenhauer would spend his mornings planning the destruction of entire cultures and his afternoons carefully preserving the intellectual achievements of the civilizations he'd previously destroyed. He was simultaneously history's greatest preserver of ancient literature and one of its most enthusiastic destroyers of human life. Let's fast forward a few millennia and visit Spain during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, who gave us the Spanish Inquisition, an institution that made torture into a bureaucratic procedure and heresy into a capital offense. The Inquisition wasn't just about religious purification, it was about creating a society where conformity was enforced through fear and difference was punished with fire. Thomas de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor, turned religious orthodoxy into a blood sport. Under his direction, the Inquisition developed torture techniques that were both scientifically precise and theologically justified. They had manuals that explained exactly how much pain was appropriate for different types of heresy, complete with illustrations and step-by-step instructions. The Spanish Inquisition introduced the world to the auto de fe, literally, act of faith, which was a public ceremony where heretics were burned alive for the entertainment and edification of the masses. These weren't just executions. They were theatrical productions complete with elaborate costumes, religious music, and audience participation. Families brought picnic lunches to watch their neighbors burn. The Inquisitors developed a legal system that made Kafka's nightmares seem reasonable by comparison. Accusations were anonymous, evidence was circumstantial, and confessions were extracted through torture that was specifically designed to be just shy of fatal. The accused were guilty until proven innocent, and proving innocence was nearly impossible when the proof required confessing to crimes you hadn't committed. What made the Inquisition particularly insidious was its bureaucratic efficiency. This wasn't random violence or mob justice, it was systematic, organized, and thoroughly documented. They kept detailed records of every torture session, every confession, every execution. It was genocide with proper filing systems and quality control procedures. The Spanish Inquisition also pioneered the concept of limpieza de sangre, or blood purity, which required people to prove that their ancestors had always been Christians. This created a society where genealogy became a matter of life and death, and family trees were scrutinized with the intensity usually reserved for criminal investigations. Having a Jewish or Muslim ancestor, no matter how distant, could result in social ostracism, economic ruin, or death. But let's not limit ourselves to European creativity in the cruelty department. Let's visit the Aztec Empire and meet Moctezuma II, who ruled over a civilization that turned human sacrifice into an industrial process. The Aztecs didn't just kill their enemies, they fed them to their gods with a regularity and efficiency that would have impressed a modern slaughterhouse supervisor. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was built on a lake and connected to the mainland by causeways that could be destroyed in case of attack. It was a city of canals and floating gardens, of magnificent pyramids and colourful markets, and of altars that ran red with human blood on a daily basis. The Templo Mayor wasn't just a religious site, it was an abattoir where thousands of people were sacrificed every year to keep the sun rising and the rains falling. The Aztecs believed that their gods required constant nourishment in the form of human hearts, and they took this responsibility very seriously. They developed elaborate rituals for different types of sacrifice, drowning children to honor the rain god, flaying people alive to celebrate agricultural fertility, and removing beating hearts while the victim was still conscious to ensure the gods received the freshest possible offering. The dedication ceremony for the rebuilt Templo Mayor allegedly involved the sacrifice of over 20,000 prisoners of war over 4 days. If true, that's an average of one human sacrifice every 17 minutes, around the clock, for 4 straight days. It was mass murder disguised as religious devotion, butchery sanctified by theological necessity. But the Aztecs weren't satisfied with ordinary human sacrifice. They developed specialty rituals that combined torture with religious symbolism. The ceremony of Xiamalpili, or the New Fire, involved extinguishing all fires in the empire and relighting them from a flame kindled on the chest of a sacrificial victim whose heart had just been removed. It was like a very violent version of the Olympic torch ceremony. The Flower Wars, or Xochimoyol, were military campaigns fought specifically to capture prisoners for sacrifice rather than to conquer territory. These weren't wars in the traditional sense. They were hunting expeditions where humans were the prey and religious obligation was the justification. The Aztecs turned warfare into a sacred duty and human sacrifice into a civic responsibility. Now let's travel to the Soviet Union during the height of Stalin's purges and meet Lavrentiy Beria, a man who combined the worst aspects of a secret police chief with the predatory instincts of a serial killer. Beria wasn't technically a dictator, but he wielded more power over life and death than most absolute monarchs, and he used that power to satisfy appetites that would have made the Marquis de Sade blush. As head of the NKVD, Beria oversaw the machinery of Stalin's terror, but he also used his position to indulge personal sadistic impulses that went far beyond political persecution. His dacha in Georgia was equipped with a basement torture chamber, where he personally interrogated prisoners, often while wearing a leather apron, like some demented craftsmen working with particularly noisy materials. Beria's specialty was the sexual torture of both men and women, often the wives and daughters of men he was investigating. He would arrest family members on fabricated charges, and then offer to release them in exchange for sexual favors, turning the apparatus of state terror into his personal procurement system for victims. He was like Harvey Weinstein with nuclear weapons and a license to kill. The man collected evidence of his own crimes with the meticulous attention to detail of a serial killer keeping trophies. His personal archive contained photographs, recordings, and written accounts of his torture sessions, as if he were compiling a greatest hits album of human suffering. When he was finally arrested after Stalin's death, investigators found rooms full of evidence documenting decades of rape, torture, and murder. Beria's influence on Soviet society extended far beyond his personal victims. As head of the secret police, he created a culture of fear so pervasive that people were afraid to express any opinion, associate with anyone who might be deemed suspicious, or even appear too happy, as excessive cheerfulness might be interpreted as evidence of counter-revolutionary sentiment. Under Beria's direction, the NKVD developed interrogation techniques that were designed not just to extract confessions, but to break the human spirit entirely. They would arrest entire families and torture them in front of each other, force parents to choose which of their children would be spared, and create psychological torments that were specifically calibrated to each victim's particular fears and weaknesses. Let's shift our attention to Cambodia again, but this time focus on the systematic nature of Khmer Rouge cruelty under Pol Pot's direction. The killing fields of Cambodia weren't just sites of mass murder, they were laboratories where ordinary people were transformed into instruments of genocide. The Khmer Rouge didn't just kill their enemies, they turned neighbours into executioners and children into murderers. S21, the notorious Tuol Sleng prison in Phnom Penh, processed over 14,000 prisoners during the Khmer Rouge regime. Of those 14,000 people, only 7 are known to have survived. It wasn't just a prison, it was a death factory with a nearly perfect mortality rate. The guards weren't professional soldiers or trained executioners. They were teenagers, some as young as 12, who had been indoctrinated to believe that mercy was a bourgeois weakness and compassion was a form of treason. The Khmer Rouge developed a classification system for executions that was based on the perceived threat level of the victim. Base people, the rural peasants who were considered ideologically pure, were usually killed quickly with a blow to the head. New people, the urban dwellers who were considered corrupted by foreign influence, were tortured extensively before being killed. Children of executed adults were also killed, because the Khmer Rouge believed that children would inevitably seek revenge for their parents' deaths. The regime's paranoia was so complete that they eventually began executing their own cadres for insufficient revolutionary fervour. Party members who showed any hesitation about carrying out executions were themselves marked for death. It created a spiral of violence where the perpetrators of genocide became its victims, and survival depended on demonstrating ever greater levels of cruelty and ideological purity. The Khmer Rouge also pioneered the use of forced confession as both psychological torture and historical documentation. Prisoners at S21 were required to write detailed autobiographies, confessing to crimes they hadn't committed and implicating friends and family members in non-existent conspiracies. These confessions were then used as evidence to justify further arrests and executions, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of terror. But perhaps most disturbing was the Khmer Rouge's systematic destruction of family bonds. Children were encouraged to spy on their parents and report any signs of disloyalty. Parents were forced to denounce their own children to prove their revolutionary commitment. The regime deliberately shattered the most basic human relationships, turning families into networks of mutual surveillance and betrayal. Let's return to Europe and examine the systematic nature of Nazi cruelty, which combined industrial efficiency with scientific methodology to create history's most organized genocide. The Holocaust wasn't just mass murder, it was mass murder with quality control procedures, performance metrics, and efficiency experts. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the German army into Eastern Europe, were responsible for murdering over 1 million Jews, Roma, and Soviet officials. But their methods were considered inefficient by Nazi standards, because shooting people one by one was too slow and too psychologically demanding on the executioners. The SS complained that mass shootings were causing morale problems among the troops. This led to the development of gas chambers, which were initially presented as a more humane method of execution, humane for the executioners, not the victims. The Nazi bureaucracy approached genocide with the same methodical attention to detail that they applied to railroad timetables and tax collection. They calculated the optimal amount of Zyklon B gas needed per victim, designed crematoria that could process a specific number of bodies per day, and developed systems for extracting gold teeth and recycling clothing with industrial efficiency. The Wannsee Conference of 1942 wasn't a gathering of crazed killers foaming at the mouth. It was a business meeting attended by lawyers, doctors, and civil servants who discussed the final solution, as if they were planning a corporate restructuring. They had charts showing Jewish populations by country, logistics plans for deportation, and cost-benefit analyses of different killing methods. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, at Auschwitz, conducted medical experiments on prisoners that had no scientific value whatsoever. He was particularly interested in twins, whom he would torture in pairs to study the differences in their responses to pain, disease, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. His experiments were pseudoscience at its most sadistic, combining the methodical approach of medical research with the moral vacuum of sociopathic cruelty. The Nazi regime also developed a sophisticated propaganda apparatus that convinced ordinary Germans to participate in genocide. They didn't just order people to kill Jews, they created an entire worldview in which killing Jews was a patriotic duty, a scientific necessity, and a moral imperative. They turned murder into a civic responsibility and genocide into a form of self-defense. But Nazi cruelty extended beyond the Holocaust. The T4 euthanasia program murdered over 70,000 disabled individuals, including children, whom the regime deemed life unworthy of life. Parents were told their disabled children were being taken to special schools for better care, and then received death certificates citing fictional causes of death. It was genocide disguised as medical treatment, murder masquerading as mercy. Let's examine the Soviet Gulag system under Stalin, which turned political repression into an economic enterprise. The gulags weren't just punishment, they were slave labor camps that contributed significantly to Soviet industrial development. Prisoners built canals, mined gold, cut timber, and constructed cities under conditions that killed millions. The White Sea Canal, one of Stalin's prestige projects, was built entirely with Gulag labor under conditions so brutal that an estimated 100,000 workers died during its construction. The canal was useless from an engineering standpoint. It was too shallow for most ships, but it served its real purpose perfectly. It consumed political prisoners and demonstrated the regime's power to transform human lives into industrial output. The Gulag system operated on a principle of planned obsolescence for human beings. Prisoners were given food rations calculated to sustain life for exactly as long as they remained useful for labor. When their productivity declined due to malnutrition, disease, or injury, their rations were reduced further, ensuring death within a predictable time frame. It was actuarial science applied to human destruction. Soviet authorities developed elaborate classification systems for political prisoners, with different categories receiving different levels of punishment. Enemies of the people were treated worse than ordinary criminals, but repeat offenders against the state faced the harshest conditions of all. The system created a hierarchy of suffering that was both bureaucratically precise and utterly arbitrary. The psychological torture in Soviet prisons was as systematic as the physical abuse. Prisoners were subjected to sleep deprivation, constant interrogation, and isolation techniques designed to break their mental resistance. The goal wasn't just to extract confessions, it was to transform human beings into broken shells who would serve as warnings to others about the consequences of opposition. Now let's visit Chile under Pinochet again, but focus specifically on the systematic nature of the regime's torture techniques. The Chilean military developed a scientific approach to torture that was taught in training manuals and refined through practice. They studied which methods produced the most reliable information, which techniques caused the most psychological damage, and which forms of abuse were least likely to leave permanent physical evidence. La Moneda Palace, the presidential residence, had soundproof rooms in the basement where prisoners were tortured while Pinochet conducted official business upstairs. It was as if the entire government was built on a foundation of screaming souls, with torture serving as the literal underground support system for political power. The DIA developed techniques that were specifically designed to leave no visible marks while causing maximum psychological trauma. They used electricity, sexual assault, forced witnessing of family members' torture, and psychological manipulation techniques that would break victims' minds while leaving their bodies technically intact. The goal wasn't just information extraction. It was the complete destruction of human dignity and the creation of terror so profound that it would paralyze any potential resistance. Chilean torture centers weren't just places of punishment. They were research facilities where new techniques were developed and tested. The regime collaborated with other South American dictatorships in Operation Condor, sharing information about torture methods, assassination techniques, and population control strategies. It was like a professional development program for state terrorism, complete with conferences, training materials, and peer review. The most chilling aspect of Pinochet's regime was its integration into everyday Chilean society. Torture centers operated in middle-class neighborhoods, where ordinary citizens could hear the screams but chose to ignore them. The regime normalized brutality to such an extent that people learned to live with the knowledge that their neighbors might disappear at any moment, and that expressing concern about these disappearances might make them the next victims. Let's journey to Iraq under Saddam Hussein and examine how modern technology enhanced ancient cruelties. Saddam's regime didn't just torture people, they filmed it, documented it, and used it as both entertainment and education. The regime produced instructional videos showing proper torture techniques, created archives of prisoner confessions obtained under duress, and maintained databases of suspected dissidents with notes about their family members' vulnerabilities. Abu Ghraib prison, which would later become infamous under American occupation, was first perfected as a torture facility under Saddam's regime. The prison wasn't just a detention center, it was a factory for producing fear. Guards were trained to identify prisoners' psychological weak points and exploit them systematically. They developed techniques for breaking family bonds by forcing parents to watch their children's torture, spouses to witness each other's sexual assault, and siblings to choose which one would be spared. Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay, elevated recreational cruelty to an art form. Uday's private torture chamber included a collection of medieval weapons, modern electrical devices, and custom-built mechanisms for prolonging suffering. He hosted parties where the entertainment included the torture and execution of suspected enemies, turning murder into a social event for Baghdad's elite. The regime also pioneered the use of chemical weapons against civilian populations, most notoriously in the Halabja massacre, where Iraqi forces used nerve agents against Kurdish villages. The attack wasn't just military strategy. It was a demonstration of the regime's willingness to use weapons of mass destruction against its own citizens. Families were found dead in their homes, still embracing each other, killed so quickly by nerve gas that they had no time to separate. But Saddam's cruelty extended beyond physical torture to psychological manipulation on a national scale. The regime created a cult of personality so pervasive that children were taught to love Saddam more than their own parents. Schools held daily rituals where students pledged allegiance to the president, and families were required to display his portrait in their homes. It was North Korea, level indoctrination with Middle Eastern brutality. Speaking of North Korea, let's visit the Hermit Kingdom and meet the Kim dynasty, which has turned an entire country into a multi-generational prison camp. Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un have created a system of oppression so complete that it extends beyond individual lives to encompass entire family lineages. In North Korea, guilt is hereditary, and punishment is a family affair that can extend across 3 generations. The North Korean Gulag system, known as Cruellest, holds an estimated 100,000 political prisoners in conditions that make Soviet gulags look like summer camps. These aren't just detention centers. They're slave labor colonies where entire families are imprisoned for the political crimes of individual members. Children born in these camps have never known freedom, and many don't even know that the outside world exists. North Korea's system of social control is based on Songbun, a caste system that classifies citizens into categories based on their family's political history. Your grandfather's political opinions can determine whether your grandchildren have access to education, employment, or adequate food. It's a system of inherited guilt that turns political persecution into a genetic condition passed down through bloodlines. The regime's cruelty is maintained through public executions that serve as both punishment and entertainment. Citizens are required to attend these events, which often involve particularly brutal methods of death designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. Public executions in North Korea aren't just about eliminating political enemies, they're about terrorizing the entire population into submission. But perhaps most insidious is the regime's control over information and human connection. North Koreans are forbidden from accessing foreign media, traveling outside the country, or communicating with the outside world. The regime has created a sealed ecosystem of ignorance, where citizens don't even know what they don't know. It's like Plato's cave allegory, except the shadows on the wall are propaganda films, and the cave guards will kill anyone who tries to turn around. The Kim regime has also perfected the art of turning victims into perpetrators. Citizens are required to attend weekly self-criticism sessions where they must confess their ideological shortcomings and report on their neighbors' suspicious behavior. These sessions transform ordinary people into unwilling collaborators in their own oppression, creating a society where everyone is simultaneously victim and victimizer. Let's return to ancient Rome and examine Nero, an emperor who turned the persecution of Christians into mass entertainment while burning down his own capital for urban redevelopment purposes. Nero's reign combined the worst aspects of artistic pretension with unlimited political power, creating a ruler who saw human suffering as raw material for creative expression. Nero's persecution of Christians following the Great Fire of Rome wasn't just religious oppression, it was performance art. He had Christians covered in pitch and used as human torches to illuminate his gardens during evening parties. He sewed them into animal skins and fed them to wild dogs for the entertainment of dinner guests. He turned martyrdom into theatre and genocide into a dinner show. The emperor's artistic ambitions were as delusional as they were deadly. He forced audiences to sit through his interminable poetry recitations and musical performances, with guards stationed throughout the theatre to ensure that no one left, fell asleep, or failed to applaud enthusiastically. People literally died of boredom at Nero's concerts, but that was preferable to showing insufficient appreciation for his artistic genius. Nero's urban planning philosophy involved burning down large sections of Rome to make room for his golden house, a palace complex so enormous it would have covered roughly a third of the city. The palace included an artificial lake, a colossal statue of himself, and dining rooms with rotating ceilings that showered guests with flower petals and perfume. It was as if a modern billionaire decided to demolish Manhattan to build a personal theme park. The emperor's cruelty toward his own family members demonstrated that even blood relations weren't safe from his paranoid delusions. He murdered his mother Agrippina, his wife Octavia, and his stepbrother Britannicus, among others, often using methods that were both elaborate and personal. He didn't just want them dead. He wanted them to know that he was killing them and why. Let's venture into the Byzantine Empire and meet Justinian and Theodora, who combined military conquest with religious persecution to create an empire built on theological terror. Justinian's reconquest of the Western Roman Empire wasn't just military expansion. It was a crusade to impose Orthodox Christianity on populations that had developed their own religious traditions during the barbarian invasions. The Nika riots in Constantinople demonstrated how Byzantine rulers dealt with domestic opposition. When chariot racing fans began protesting political corruption, Justinian and Theodora responded by trapping over 30,000 rioters in the Hippodrome and massacring them. It was crowd control through genocide, urban planning through mass murder. Theodora's background as a former actress and prostitute didn't make her more sympathetic to society's outcasts. It made her more vicious in suppressing them. She understood how precarious social position could be, and she used that knowledge to identify and eliminate potential threats to her power. She was like a social climber with an army and a license to kill anyone who reminded her of her past. The Justinian Code, while historically important as a legal document, was also a blueprint for systematic oppression. It codified discrimination against Jews, Samaritans, and Christian heretics, making persecution a legal requirement rather than just a policy preference. The law itself became a weapon of religious terror, turning judges into executioners and courtrooms into inquisition chambers. But let's not neglect the creativity of more recent dictators. Let's examine Idi Amin's Uganda in greater detail, focusing on how he combined traditional African warfare customs with modern technology to create uniquely horrifying forms of mass murder. Amin didn't just kill his enemies, he incorporated elements of ritual warfare and cannibalism into state policy, turning ancient customs into instruments of modern political terror. Amin's expulsion of Uganda's Indian population wasn't just economic nationalism, it was ethnic cleansing disguised as anti-colonial liberation. He gave Uganda's entire Indian community 90 days to leave the country, allowing them to take only the clothes on their backs. Then he distributed their businesses and properties to his supporters, who promptly ran them into the ground, destroying Uganda's economy in the process. The dictator's personal involvement in torture sessions wasn't just sadism. It was political theater designed to demonstrate his absolute power over life and death. He would personally participate in the torture and execution of prisoners, often while eating meals or conducting other business, as if murder were just another item on his daily schedule. Amin's claim that he ate human flesh wasn't just psychological warfare. It was a deliberate invocation of traditional African beliefs about consuming one's enemies to absorb their power. He combined pre-colonial spiritual practices with modern political persecution, creating a form of terror that was both ancient and contemporary, both traditional and totalitarian. The international community's response to Amin's atrocities demonstrated how geopolitical considerations often trumped human rights concerns. Despite clear evidence of mass murder, many countries continued to maintain diplomatic relations with his regime because Uganda wasn't strategically important enough to justify intervention. It was realpolitik at its most cynical, with human lives serving as acceptable collateral damage for larger political calculations. Let's examine the Rwandan genocide, which compressed the scale of Holocaust level murder into just 100 days of machete-wielding madness. The genocide wasn't spontaneous tribal violence. It was a carefully planned and executed campaign of extermination that used traditional weapons to carry out modern genocidal strategies. The Hutu power movement didn't just promote ethnic hatred, it created a comprehensive ideology that portrayed Tutsi extermination as both historical necessity and moral imperative. Radio stations broadcast instructions for locating and killing Tutsis, complete with descriptions of physical characteristics and hiding places. It was genocide by broadcast, murder by media instruction. Rwandan killers weren't professional soldiers or trained executioners. They were ordinary citizens, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, who were mobilized to kill their neighbors with agricultural tools. The genocide demonstrated how quickly civilized societies could collapse into barbarism when the proper psychological and social conditions were created by determined leaders. The use of rape as a weapon of genocide in Rwanda wasn't just individual violence. It was systematic biological warfare designed to destroy Tutsi identity through sexual assault and forced pregnancy. Women weren't just killed. They were deliberately infected with HIV, impregnated by their attackers, and left to bear children who would serve as permanent reminders of their trauma. The international community's response to the Rwandan genocide revealed the limitations of post-Holocaust promises that such atrocities would never again be allowed to occur. Despite clear evidence of ongoing genocide, the United Nations actually reduced its peacekeeping force in Rwanda and refused to use the word genocide to describe events that clearly met the legal definition. Let's return to the Soviet Union and examine the Holodomor, Stalin's artificial famine in Ukraine, which demonstrated how food could be weaponized to achieve political goals. The famine wasn't a natural disaster or an unintended consequence of poor policy. It was deliberately created to break Ukrainian resistance to Soviet collectivization. Stalin's regime didn't just confiscate grain. They confiscated every possible source of nutrition, including vegetables from private gardens, livestock, and even tree bark that people might eat to survive. Search teams went from house to house looking for hidden food, turning neighbors into informants and survival into a crime against the state. Ukrainian villages were sealed off to prevent residents from seeking food elsewhere, creating outdoor concentration camps where entire populations slowly starved to death. People were forbidden to leave their villages, and anyone caught trying to obtain food from other regions was arrested as a saboteur or counter-revolutionary. The famine created conditions so desperate that cannibalism became widespread, with parents eating their own children to survive. Soviet authorities knew this was happening and used it as propaganda to portray Ukrainians as backwards and savage, justifying further repression as civilizing influence on barbaric people. International observers, including Western journalists and diplomats, witnessed the famine but were either forbidden from reporting on it or chose to ignore it for political reasons. The New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty actually won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting that denied the famine was occurring, demonstrating how propaganda could be disguised as journalism when it served powerful interests. But let's not limit ourselves to political dictators. Let's examine religious extremism and meet some of history's most cruel theocrats, starting with Tomás de Torquemada and the Spanish Inquisition. Torquemada didn't just persecute heretics, he created a theological system that made torture a sacrament and murder a form of worship. The Inquisition's procedures weren't just legal proceedings, they were religious rituals designed to purify society through the elimination of religious diversity. The accused weren't just defendants, they were specimens in a theological laboratory where orthodox belief was tested through the application of systematic pain. Inquisitors developed detailed manuals explaining exactly how much torture was appropriate for different types of heresy, complete with instructions for using specific devices and techniques to maximize pain while minimizing the risk of accidental death. It was scientific method applied to sadistic purposes, empirical research in the field of human suffering. The auto de fe ceremonies weren't just executions, they were community festivals where entire populations gathered to celebrate the burning of their neighbors. These events included parades, music, and elaborate theatrical productions that turned murder into entertainment and genocide into a form of popular culture. The Inquisition also pioneered techniques of social control that would later be adopted by secular totalitarian regimes. They created networks of informants who reported on their neighbors' religious practices, established systems for monitoring private behavior, and developed methods for extracting confessions that implicated other suspected heretics. Let's travel to Iran and examine the Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini, who combined religious fanaticism with modern police state techniques to create a theocracy built on systematic oppression. Khomeini's revolution didn't just change Iran's government, it transformed an entire society into a testing ground for religious totalitarianism. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps wasn't just a military force, it was a religious police organization that monitored every aspect of Iranian society for signs of insufficient piety. They enforced dress codes for women, monitored private gatherings for unauthorized religious or political discussions, and created an atmosphere of constant surveillance disguised as spiritual guidance. Iranian authorities didn't just execute political opponents. They developed elaborate ritual procedures for carrying out death sentences that combined traditional Islamic law with modern bureaucratic efficiency. Public executions were conducted according to precise religious protocols that turned murder into worship and terror into theology. The Iran-Iraq War became a laboratory for testing religious motivation in warfare, with Iranian authorities using child soldiers as human mind detectors and suicide bombers. Young boys were given plastic keys to paradise and sent across minefields to clear paths for regular troops, turning religious faith into a form of military technology. The regime's treatment of women wasn't just gender discrimination, it was systematic dehumanization disguised as religious protection. Women were reduced to the legal status of property, forbidden from appearing in public without male supervision, and subjected to punishment for violations of religious dress codes that included public flogging and imprisonment. Now let's examine some of history's most creative torturers, starting with Vlad the Impaler, who elevated cruelty to an art form and gave his name to one of literature's most famous monsters. Vlad Dracul didn't just kill his enemies, he created forests of impaled bodies that served as both military strategy and artistic expression. Impalement, Vlad's signature execution method, wasn't just a way to kill people, it was psychological warfare designed to terrorize entire populations into submission. The process could take hours or days to complete, depending on the skill of the executioner and the specific technique used. Vlad developed multiple variations of the procedure, each designed for different types of victims and different strategic purposes. Vlad's dinner parties were legendary for their combination of fine dining and mass murder. He would feast while surrounded by forests of impaled victims, sometimes ordering the removal of particularly aromatic corpses that might interfere with his appetite. It was dinner theatre with a body count, gourmet dining with a side of genocide. The psychological impact of Vlad's cruelty extended far beyond his immediate victims. Ottoman armies would retreat rather than face him in battle, not because of his military superiority, but because of his reputation for torture that was so creative and prolonged that death in conventional warfare seemed preferable to capture by his forces. Vlad's methods weren't just random sadism. They were calculated political strategies designed to maintain power through fear. He understood that a few spectacular atrocities could be more effective than conventional military force in controlling large populations, making terror a cost-effective tool of governance. Let's journey to Japan during World War II and examine Unit 731, where Japanese medical researchers combined scientific methodology with systematic torture to create one of history's most horrifying examples of medical evil. Unit 731 wasn't just a research facility. It was a place where human beings were reduced to experimental materials in service of both military strategy and scientific curiosity. Dr. Shiro Ishii and his colleagues didn't just conduct medical experiments, they performed vivisections on conscious subjects, tested biological weapons on prisoners, and froze people alive to study the effects of extreme cold. They called their human subjects logs, reducing them to the status of inanimate materials in laboratory procedures that combined the worst aspects of scientific research with industrial-scale murder. The unit's research into biological warfare wasn't just academic inquiry, it was weapons development that involved infecting entire populations with plague, cholera, and other diseases to test their effectiveness as military tools. They dropped plague, infected fleas on Chinese cities, and studied the resulting epidemics with the detached interest of entomologists observing insect behavior. Japanese authorities didn't just cover up Unit 731's activities after the war, they negotiated immunity for the researchers in exchange for their data, allowing war criminals to escape prosecution and continue their careers in post-war Japan and the United States. The scientific community's acceptance of research, conducted through torture and murder, demonstrated how professional advancement could overcome moral objections when the results were considered valuable. The psychological impact on the researchers themselves revealed how ordinary people could become monsters when institutional authority provided permission and scientific methodology provided justification. Many of Unit 731's personnel were respected doctors and scientists who convinced themselves that their work served legitimate research purposes, despite its obviously criminal nature. But let's not forget the creativity of more recent monsters. Let's examine the Bosnian genocide, where ethnic cleansing was combined with systematic rape to create a form of genocide that was both physical and psychological. Bosnian Serb forces didn't just kill their enemies, they used rape as a weapon of war designed to destroy cultural identity through sexual violence. Rape camps weren't just military facilities, they were institutions designed to break down ethnic identity through systematic sexual assault that was intended to produce children who would carry their attackers' DNA. It was biological warfare disguised as sexual violence, genocide through forced pregnancy. The siege of Sarajevo wasn't just military strategy, it was a 4-year torture session conducted against an entire city. Snipers targeted civilians going about their daily activities, turning simple tasks like getting water or attending school into potentially fatal activities. Children grew up playing in areas designed to provide cover from gunfire, normalizing warfare as a condition of daily life. Serbian forces didn't just commit atrocities, they documented them, creating video records of mass executions and torture sessions that were intended both as trophies and as psychological weapons. The systematic documentation of war crimes revealed how perpetrators took pride in their activities and wanted to preserve evidence of their cruelty. The international community's response to the Bosnian genocide demonstrated how bureaucratic procedures could be used to delay intervention while atrocities continued. The United Nations peacekeeping mission was specifically forbidden from taking sides or protecting civilians, creating a situation where international observers witnessed genocide while being prohibited from preventing it. As we near the end of our journey through the darkest corners of human history, it becomes clear that the capacity for cruelty isn't an aberration, but a consistent thread woven through the fabric of human civilization. These dictators, tyrants, and monsters weren't aliens from another planet or supernatural demons. They were human beings, as human as anyone reading these words, who discovered that power without restraint could be used to satisfy the darkest impulses of human nature. What makes these figures particularly terrifying isn't their foreignness, but their familiarity. They all started as someone's son, someone's brother, someone's neighbor. They ate breakfast, worried about their appearance, and probably complained about the weather. Then they acquired power, and power revealed what had been lurking beneath the surface of their humanity all along. The lesson isn't that these were uniquely evil individuals who emerged from particularly barbarous societies. The lesson is that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists within human nature itself, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, ideology, and institutional support to manifest itself in ways that shock us precisely because we recognize something familiar in their monstrosity. Every society contains potential collaborators, potential victims, and potential resistors. The difference between a civilization and a killing field often comes down to institutions, laws, and cultural norms that either restrain or unleash the worst aspects of human nature. Democracy, rule of law, and human rights aren't just political concepts. They're barriers against the darkness that exists within human nature itself. These dictators succeeded not because they were superhuman monsters, but because they were all too human. They understood something fundamental about human psychology, that most people will participate in atrocities if given permission by authority figures, will ignore obvious evil if acknowledging it requires personal risk, and will convince themselves that obviously immoral actions are justified if those actions serve their immediate interests. The true horror of these historical figures isn't that they were uniquely evil, but that they were representative of possibilities that exist within human nature itself. Their legacies serve as warnings not about what monsters can do, but about what we ourselves might become under the right circumstances, with the right pressures, and with the right justifications. The story of human cruelty is ultimately a story about the importance of choosing, again and again, to remain human in the face of pressures that would turn us into something else. These dictators remind us that civilization isn't a permanent achievement, but a daily choice that must be made by individuals who understand that power without restraint inevitably becomes power without humanity. And so we close this catalogue of human monsters not with despair, but but with the knowledge that understanding evil is the first step toward preventing it. These names, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, Amin, Pinochet, and all the rest, serve as reminders that the price of freedom isn't just eternal vigilance against external enemies, but eternal vigilance against the monsters that lurk within ourselves, waiting for the right moment to emerge and turn civilization back into the killing field from which it originally emerged. The question isn't whether such monsters will arise again. The question is whether we'll recognize them in time, whether we'll have the courage to resist them, and whether we'll remember that the difference between civilization and barbarism is often nothing more than the willingness of ordinary people to say no when authority figures ask them to participate in the systematic destruction of human dignity. These dictators built their empires on the compliance of millions of ordinary people who chose comfort over courage, safety over resistance, and personal survival over moral principle. Their greatest weapon wasn't military technology or secret police, but the willingness of decent people to look the other way while indecent things were done in their name. That's the final lesson from our tour through history's chamber of horrors. Evil triumphs, not because it's stronger than good, but because it's often more convenient than good. The monsters of history succeeded because they made it easier to collaborate than to resist, safer to participate than to object, and more profitable to comply than to refuse. The antidote to such evil isn't superhuman heroism, but ordinary decency consistently applied, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's dangerous, and even when no one is watching. The real heroes of history aren't the ones who performed spectacular acts of resistance, but the ones who maintained their humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. In the end, the story of human cruelty is also the story of human choice. We become monsters not through some inevitable biological destiny, but through a series of small compromises, minor accommodations, and gradual erosions of moral principle that ultimately transform decent people into participants in indecent systems. The dictators in this narrative remind us that evil is not a supernatural force, but a human choice, not an external threat, but an internal possibility, and not a historical aberration, but a recurring temptation that each generation must learn to recognize and resist anew.